The following talk is sponsored by the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. If you're watching the video on YouTube, please take a moment and subscribe to the Academy YouTube channel. You can always access the channel by going to classicalliberarts.com/YouTube. We hope that you enjoy the lesson. God bless. Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to talk to parents and possibly students, maybe even private school teachers, but mainly homeschool parents whom I deal most with, about the real goal of education, because I think for homeschool parents especially, there is a constant distraction and temptation to fall into errors in education, fall into errors with respect to our thoughts about education, priorities in education, and so on, that lead us away from the true goal of education, which very few students work to fulfill. Now, in my work in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I spend dozens and dozens of hours every week reviewing and grading student work and giving feedback. And as time goes on, I've become convinced that that work of reviewing student work and giving feedback is really the essential work of teaching and education. It's sort of like the sacrament of confession or reconciliation in the Catholic Church. You know, we have lots of resources available in the Catholic Church. We've got homilies and all kinds of Catholic schools and programs, but really where the rubber meets the road in the individual Catholic life is in the confessional, where we're able to discuss our own faults and weaknesses and receive counsel and direction from our own personal confessor about how to move forward and get better as a Catholic. Grading assignments, providing students with feedback, and so on is really the nitty-gritty, dirty work of education. And it's work that most teachers try to minimize because it's very difficult work. Teachers don't get paid for the hours that they spend grading. They usually do it on their own time, and so they try to avoid it as much as possible. You know, the whole idea of giving the kids an automatically graded quiz or a Scantron exam or having some easy multiple choice assignment for them to do that can be quickly graded, that's often a goal for teachers. But the problem with education is that the goal of education is to move a student from one group of people into another group of people. And the only way that that transition can happen is through long and slow, painstaking work done at the individual level. And so what I'd like to talk about today is what the real goal is in education for our children and what we should focus on, how we should approach it, what our disposition should be towards our children's studies, and so on, because most schools, most parents, most homeschools, most students are going to miss this. And it really is the difference between having a good education and not having a good education. Now, when we look at society, we can see in every different area of life, we can see that there are two different kinds of people. There are consumers and there are producers. So I can get on the phone and I can call up a carpenter and say, hey, I'd like a deck built on my house. I can't build it, but I'm a consumer with respect to carpentry. The carpenter is a producer with respect to carpentry. Same thing with medicine. If I get sick, I could say, you know, I need a remedy for this sickness that I have. I call up a doctor. I'm the consumer with respect to medicine. The doctor is, in this sense, the producer with respect to medicine. as far as I'm concerned. And this is how society works, where we have consumers and producers, and this is how we do business and trade. So anytime we talk about future planning or occupation or studying for the sake of future work and career plans, vocations, things like that, we're talking about moving from the realm or the group of consumers into the group of producers in some certain field or in a number of different fields. And that's really what education is for. It's to help a student move from the group of consumers to the group of producers, because that's how one makes a living, and not just financially, but that's how one finds and fulfills a vocation, all right? To become not the user of a service or a product, but the producer or the one who offers a service or a product. That's really what education is for. And the question we have to ask is, well, how do we do that, right? How do we do that? And what the difference in a poorly designed school and a well-planned school is that a poorly designed school won't lead students to make that transition. A poorly designed school won't lead students to move from one group to the other. It will simply give them activities, give them busy work, give them information, all kinds of stuff to do, but the stuff that they do does not actually lead them from the group that they're in, at the beginning, where they start from, into the group where we'd like to move into through education. So that's the mark. That's really what makes a school an ineffective school. Now, when we look at the public school system, we find that the public school system is almost designed to produce a society of consumers. It's not intended to produce any kind of expertise in any area, and everything about the school, the way the school operates, the activities the students do, and so on, it just says, you are the consumers, the teachers are the producers in that sense. So just do what you're told, follow the instructions, and you'll get your diploma at the end. Well, that would be bad, but what's worse is that private schools follow the same model and do the same thing. They set themselves up in the same way. The students are put in the same position. The teachers take upon themselves the same position, and the same results are produced. The students graduate, they obtain a diploma, and that diploma really doesn't signify anything with respect to transitioning from one group to the other. Not only is this done in private schools, but it's also done in homeschools, because most homeschooling parents, the only education that they've ever had, the only experience that they've ever had in education has been in that modern school environment where the teachers are the producers and the students are the consumers. And so when you've got a whole culture of people or a whole society of people who really have never had an experience outside of that teacher-student school experience, where the students are treated like consumers and the teachers are treated like the producers or the workers, you have this ignorant, unproductive, ineffective idea of education, and it just goes on and on and on. Now, what happens is some parents, some adults get frustrated because they know that this system is not working, and so they propose a change. But these people themselves don't understand the nature of the change that's needed, and so what they produce is something that appears to be a change, but really is just more of the same thing. And a good example of this is what I always talk about as the fake classical education movement. We could also call it great books education, because what happens in this fake classical education movement is that some people look at the modern schools and they say, you know, what's wrong with these schools is they're not giving the children the right information. They're not giving the students the right courses. They're not using the right books. They're not teaching the right content. The the students aren't learning enough information. They need to learn more information or different information. And so we've got this so-called curriculum set up which proposes to give the children access to better information from supposedly better sources. But what's being ignored in this is that the same problem, the same root problem in the modern school is not being addressed. And the real problem is that students are not being led from that group of consumers to the actual producers in any field, in any area of their lives. That's the essential problem in education, in modern education. Really, since the time of the Protestant Reformation, that has been the characteristic of education from the 1500s. It was at that time, around the time of the scientific revolution, the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, all of those movements are kind of different sides of the same animal, as it were. We had the rise of what's called encyclopedic learning, where we think that teaching children, leading children to the truth means teaching them an encyclopedia of information. And that idea of delivering information to the children became the nature of education starting in the 16th century. And that's not the purpose of education. If we look before that in history, we'll find that that was never what education or what schools worked to accomplish with the children. They didn't teach encyclopedic information. They taught arts. They taught skills that were necessary for learning what we call the classical liberal arts. So there was a major change in the nature of education between the medieval world and the modern world. And movements like the fake classical education movement, they're just modern forms of education that are rebranded and made to look like they're something different. And again, when the audience that they're presented to doesn't know any better, it often works. And objectively speaking, we can say that what's offered in a fake classical school or through a fake classical study program may be objectively better than what's available in other schools. But it's a better option of a bad system or a bad philosophy of education. It's like saying one Protestant church is better than another, but they're both wrong. That's the problem. Okay? So the real issue that we have to think about as parents and as educators is how students are led from the one group, which is really the group of the ignorant, the consumer, and consumers in our society are customers, from the consumer to the producer. That's the real goal of education. And the way we do that is not through information. And this is the temptation and the distraction that parents have to learn to ignore. And it's difficult. It's difficult to resist this because you'll feel the pressure from this modern society, especially as your children are growing up. You'll feel the pressure to give an account for your children's progress in the the course of information that our society has decided is important to be known, even at different points of their school years. What your second graders should know and what your fifth graders should know and what your ninth graders should know and so on. What courses you should study, what subjects you should be learning about and so on. All of this encyclopedia of information has been chopped up into bits and scheduled, and everyone is held accountable to where they are in this, in the encyclopedia. And all of this is artificial, and it's all a bunch of baloney. And where we see this all exposed, is at the end of high school education. There's a couple different places where we see the falsehood of this whole idea of education exposed. The first one comes when students take the SAT, and schools have an advantage right now because of COVID and all the craziness of the COVID year or two. Schools have been screwed up so much that supposedly, and again, this is all baloney, supposedly the kids can't be given SATs because of COVID. So for the past 3 or 4 years and for the following 2 or 3 years, colleges are not looking at SAT scores because it's just been decided that COVID has caused so much trouble that the poor kids in the modern schools can't recover. So we can't look at SAT scores. But the reason why modern schools hate the SAT is because the SAT exposes the fault of this whole modern philosophy of education. The reason why the SAT does this is because it tests study skills. It tests skills that are judged to be necessary for success in college learning, in a college environment. That's why it used to be called the Scholastic Aptitude Test. That's what the SAT originally stood for. Scholastic Aptitude Test. And aptitude means ability. It's not testing your high school education. It's not testing what you know. It's testing your ability to learn in a certain environment in a certain way, namely at the university level, where life is very different than it is in a K-12 school system. So the SAT is always complained about by modern teachers and parents and students because it doesn't reward children who succeed in the modern school system, because the modern school system and all that it does and teaches really has nothing to do with success outside of that artificial school system. So the schools will do anything they can to get their kids out of the SAT, and that's the first place where the faults of modern education are revealed. The second place is in college itself, college admission, college studies, and so on. When we look at college admission requirements and what college admissions representatives are looking for when they review applications, we find that it has almost nothing to do with what K-12 schools or parents or students are talking about. I always recommend this to parents to take a school that you consider a selective university. Most of the private colleges that Catholics send their kids to are not selective universities. They're not selective colleges. They have admission rates over 70%, which means they're really accepting everyone who applies. That's not what I'm talking about, because that's really not a desirable end of college admission. I'm talking about selective schools that are sorting through high demand of interest from students and are really separating the desired students from the undesirable students. If you read the requirements for selective college admission, and again, modern parents don't like to talk about this because the American spirit is that, I'm always right, whatever I want to do is right, no one has the right to judge me, and so they do their own will. But they do that because they don't have an option, right? They don't have an option. But when a school is presented with a large body of students and they've got the opportunity to actually select the best students, there are specific things that they look for. And so these things are communicated by college admissions boards to prospective students to direct them as to how they should prepare for university life and study. And most high schools, most home schools, most parents, most students don't do these things. So first of all, in college, students have access to almost endless resources. They have access to endless resources. And the question is, which students are going to actually come to campus and make good use of these resources? It's not going to be the kid who's got to be dragged out of bed by mommy every day. It's not going to be the kid who has to be motivated by, charismatic teachers in the classroom every day. It's a kid who wants to learn It's a kid who gets himself up and seeks out opportunities to learn and makes use of educational resources. That's the kind of student colleges are looking for. That's the opposite of the kid that most schools are producing and serving. That's the opposite of how most parents think about education. That's the opposite of how most homeschools work. But that's what selective colleges are looking for, because they have millions and millions and millions of dollars of resources, and they want to find students who are going to make the best use of them. And that use has to come from the student, because it's not just an extension of high school. It's a very different environment where students are independent. The professors are not babysitters. No one's going to check to make sure a student shows up to class or does his homework. It's much more mature, and students are expected to work independently. So they're looking for students who are mature, students have real interests, students who are motivated to study and learn, students who make use of the opportunities that are available to them, students who seek out the most rigorous studies available for themselves, and so on. And this is all the opposite of what most modern schools and homeschools do. So again, the modern school method and system, they're exposed as students get further on. They're exposed by SATs, which try to predict college success and really don't respect anything that the modern schools do. If you look at modern Catholic schools, you'll find that almost all of them, even homeschools, you'll find that almost all of them average SAT scores that are not impressive. I know just because they publish it on their website, Seton Home Study, which is probably the most popular Catholic homeschool curriculum, boasts on their website that their average SAT score is 50 points higher than the average American public school student. I mean, think of how pathetic that really is, that a family would choose to homeschool their children, invest in Catholic study materials, and the end result would be 50 points in the average difference between those students and the average public school kid. Public schools don't get to choose their students. They teach and accept whoever the bus drops off every morning. And the difference is going to be 50 points. Now, you may not know why that's significant, but I can tell you that if you enroll your child in an SAT prep program like the Princeton Review, I know this because I used to work for the Princeton Review, but if you enroll your kids in a Princeton Review SAT prep course, they will guarantee, just by completing a little prep course, they will guarantee that your child's score will rise 100 points. So an entire Catholic homeschool curriculum produces less of an increase in SAT scores than a simple Princeton Review SAT prep course. That's the standard that we've just become, we've come content with, we've come accustomed to. And really, we have to learn to not allow ourselves to be content with barely being better than the average public school students in terms of these measures of academic aptitude, academic ability. So, you can look at that and say, oh, it's better, great. But no, it's not acceptable considering the investment that's been made for such a meager difference or improvement in the outcome. We can't accept that. It's not acceptable. And plus, it's not addressing the issue. This is why there's no significant difference, because it's not addressing the actual goal of education. It's just providing a different form, albeit somewhat better, a different form of the same problematic educational program. That's the problem. So having said all that, what I would like to discuss is what the difference really needs to be, what the solution really is, because this is what, for all of the hype and hubbub and all of the running around and spending money on education and changing schools and using this program, that program, this, all of that is just, like I say, moving furniture around in the living room. You're not changing anything. You're just moving the same stuff around in different arrangements and imagining that you've made a change, but you've just moved stuff around. There's no actual progress further towards the goal. You're just spinning your tires, moving furniture around in the same place. What needs to be done to actually advance towards the goal of real education? Well, the first thing that you need to understand as a parent and as a student, even as a teacher, you need to understand that real education is not about information. It's not collecting information. It's not encyclopedic. The goal of real education is not to become smart, not to know lots of trivia, not to be good at Jeopardy. That's not the goal of education. That encyclopedic learning, that philosophy of education, does not come from Catholic educational history. Catholics did not invent the idea of encyclopedic learning. That was an anti-Catholic idea of education. If we go back into the history of Catholic education, what we find is classical liberal arts education. If we go back into ancient Greece, we find classical liberal arts education. If we go into Rome, we find classical liberal arts education. Into Catholic medieval history, we find classical liberal arts education. Go all the way back, ancient Egypt, ancient Babylon, we find classical liberal arts education. Not modern encyclopedic learning. That's the fundamental difference. So think of them as two different boxes. You've got one box where the goal of what people actually, and you've got to ignore all of the school talk, ignore all of the marketing, ignore all of the conference talks and lectures, because no one will admit that they serve the end of encyclopedic learning. No one will admit that. They will all claim that they're, to borrow the term, recovering the lost tools of learning. They'll all say that, but they don't. So you've got two boxes. You've got one box, which is encyclopedic learning, and you can have the furniture rearranged in all different ways inside that box, but it's still the same thing, still the same problem. And the other box is classical liberal arts education. Now, what's the fundamental difference? How can you look at one program and another and see this one is right, that one is wrong? How can you tell the difference? It's very, very simple. The difference is in the word arts. Arts is the difference. The classical liberal arts curriculum teaches students the arts of learning. That's the difference. The encyclopedic educational model teaches kids information, teaches them about subjects, tells them what to believe, tells them what to say, tells them what to write about, tells them the answers, and then asks them to repeat the answers. That's encyclopedic learning. That is not true education. True education focuses on teaching students the arts of learning. And so when we look at the classical liberal arts, we see that throughout history there were 7: grammar, reasoning, rhetoric, arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. There were 7 liberal arts, or 7 arts that were considered the tools that students needed to possess in order to advance into the pursuit of wisdom, into the pursuit of real learning, real learning. And so when we look beyond those liberal arts, we find the sciences. We find the philosophical sciences, moral philosophy, natural philosophy, metaphysics, which is actually a part of natural philosophy. But we find the philosophical sciences, which are produced by the liberal arts. The arts are the tools, The arts are the method that's used to produce the philosophical sciences. We also have the theological sciences. The theological sciences, again, are different from the philosophical sciences because they incorporate divine revelation, but they still depend upon the same classical liberal arts for their development and understanding. And even more important, the sciences, the philosophical sciences, the theological sciences, they also depend upon the classical liberal arts for critical study, for improvement, for perfection, as it were, for development through time. So the sciences and the arts need to be separated. What students need to learn in school are the arts. That's what they're supposed to be developing. That's what they're supposed to be learning and working on. They're supposed to be learning the principles of the arts, and they're supposed to be collecting these arts like tools in a toolbox that they're then going to go on and use for the rest of their lives in real education and real work in whatever field they go into. It doesn't matter what field they go into, because those arts are like the tools. They're like the universal tools of all human work. And the key word there is human work, right? So that's the fundamental difference between true education and false education. True education makes the students the experts. It gives them the tools to become the producers of the sciences. False education does not give the students the tools to become the producers, but simply tests them on how well they're consuming the information that they're being given. And that's not the goal of education. Now, the problem that private schools face, the problem that homeschool parents face, is that there are tons and tons and tons and tons of resources produced for modern encyclopedic education. Tons and tons and tons. Constantly new programs, all kinds of bells, whistles, catalogs, websites. It just goes on endlessly, all to serve this modern encyclopedic learning. Now, I'm not saying that that stuff is bad intrinsically, but it's not education. That's the problem. It's not education. For example, my wife and I recently had a discussion because there's a series, you're probably familiar with it, you may be familiar with it, there's a series called The Great Courses where these college professors have recorded all of these lectures on videos, and they cover all kinds of subjects from mathematics and natural sciences all the way up through history and, everything else. And you look at these programs, and parents get all excited about them, and you can set them up and subscribe to them, and you let your kids watch them. But what the problem is for all of this information gathering, for all of this activity, you're still not addressing the core focus of education, which is the development of the skills of learning. That's the problem. It's encyclopedic. Yes, you can learn lots of interesting information, but is any of that information being verified? So you see how you constantly come back to this original question, which is, what is true? What is true? What's the truth about history? Is it what the history teacher says? Is that what's true about history? Or is that actually the question? And the study of history is a debate about what happened. What's true in the natural sciences? Is it what the science teacher says is true? Or is that the question in the natural sciences? What is actually true? You see how that idea of having kids learn the information is presenting them with an image where they are the consumer and the teacher is the producer, and that's not how learning works. Those kids are not being taught. Even though they're participating in this academic activity, they're not being taught to actually become wise men. They're being treated like ignorant consumers and being told what to believe, and then they're going to be tested on whether they have learned what the teacher told them. And that's going to be the supposed measure of their success in education. How upside down is all of that? And this is the problem with modern Christian society. Christians are not learning the classical liberal arts as they used to, and that's why we don't have people in society like St. Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas. We don't have Catholics like that in society because we don't have these master artists, these masters of the classical liberal arts coming into these modern discussions, these modern sciences, all of these different controversial issues, and bringing with them all of these arts to get to work and answer questions and find the truth. We don't have people like that in modern society. And we feel this. This is why if you look at the books that are published, they're not like St. Augustine's City of God. They're not like St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, and we all know that. But there's a reason for it, and it's because the method of education is based on a false philosophy of learning, and kids are being raised in it. Now, how this applies in the academy is, in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, I am concerned with students learning the classical liberal arts. I have them all marked. If you look at our curriculum at classicalliberarts.com, when you get into the study center, all of these classical liberal arts courses are marked and they're labeled core courses. Everything else is enrichment. The classical liberal arts are the core courses. And what I will always find, even though the program is called the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, parents will always gravitate towards enrichment courses. They will always be trying to enroll students in information courses. They'll always be concerned about literature. They'll always be concerned about history. They'll always be concerned about the natural science courses where the kids can start collecting information, because they want their kids to be smart, which is, sort of the goal of modern education, for everybody to be smart, to have these little clever know-it-alls walking around who can rattle off all the information from their classes. Name all the elements on the periodic table, name all the capitals of the states, recite all their memory facts, and so on. That's the ideal modern school student. That is not the ideal school student. The focus needs to be on the arts. So for example, I'll have students enrolled in history classes, and these students, their parents are trying to make them learn history, and these kids can't write sentences because the parents are so concerned with the kids appearing to be smart and knowing historical information that they are neglecting the ability to write a sentence, which is obviously the priority in real learning. So they're not studying grammar, they're not studying composition, they're not studying logic and rhetoric, they're not studying the arts of the quadrivium. They're trying to bypass all of that and jump into the information courses, which are offered as enrichment courses, which I intend to be studied critically by students, not just mindlessly consumed. And they're trying to have their kids advance in information when the poor kids can't even write sentences. And this is modern education. Even in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, where everything is laid out and courses are labeled as the core courses, where all of this problem of modern education has been removed and a true curriculum made accessible, the parents will still try to fly over that real curriculum and get their kids into the information courses. And they're concerned about those information courses. They're concerned about their 6-year-old learning history or even getting into biology. Even though the kid can't read, he cannot write, he doesn't know how to reason, he's not learning mathematics, They're trying to get him learning information so he can appear to be smart. And you just see that even in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, if you look at the courses that students are working on every day, no matter how hard I push and push and push, you will see that the parents are still pushing the kids into modern courses that are not going to help them progress intellectually, that are not going to move them from the box of consumers into the box of producers. The parents are the source of much of this trouble because they don't understand what the real goals are. And because the work of studying the arts is very, very difficult. It's very difficult. And this is what parents don't want to deal with. This is what teachers don't want to deal with. This is what students don't want to deal with. They don't want to deal with the difficulty of learning the classical liberal arts. And so we see this aversion in their daily activities. Now, as I said before, I see everything the other way around. When I'll be grading a history assignment, and I can see that a student can't write a complete sentence. I don't care about the history lesson. I care about the student's ability to write a complete sentence. And I tell the student, you've got to study English composition or even elementary grammar first, because you're wasting your time trying to study history. You're wasting your time collecting this information because you don't have the skills of learning. You're not progressing in the arts. And so I'm constantly pushing kids back to the arts, but it's always met with resistance. And it's not just the students. It's also the parents. And this is the problem. There is so much resistance to real education because it's difficult, and no one wants to be bothered with the challenges of real education. No one wants to study the classical liberal arts. They love the modern school system. They love this encyclopedic learning. And I've found that it's almost impossible, even with what I consider to be devout, serious Catholic families, it's almost impossible to get them to understand and acknowledge that gathering information is not the purpose of education. Real education requires the study and mastery of the liberal arts. It's very difficult. It's often very boring. It's painstaking. It's slow. But the person who has to pay the most for that is me. I'm the one who has to bear the greatest burden in this, because I could be like these modern great books teachers who just say, hey, we're just going to read a book together and talk about it. Woohoo, you know? That's just lazy. It's pretending to be teaching, because these kids can't read and appreciate the great books because they don't have the skills that those authors had. That's why they can't appreciate them. And the teachers are accountable to no standards because there's no one, including the teacher himself, who has any way to actually evaluate the real qualities of different works. They're often not even studied in the original language. They're often not even studied in the actual format that the works were written in. For example, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were poems. It's Greek poetry. They're often studied in prose, in English translation. Virgil's Aeneid was Latin poetry. It's often studied in English prose. So the value of these works was not that they told cool stories. They were amazing poems. Homer and Virgil were famous poets. And so the real nature of the work is not even respected when they're just turned into these cheap English great books courses, and these kids are gathered together to pretend like they're all a bunch of classical scholars reading English prose translations of what were Greek and Latin poems. That's the fake classical education movement. And what are those kids learning? They're just learning trivia. They're learning the names of the characters. They're learning some of the storylines. They're having it explained to them by the teacher, and they're just repeating back to the teacher what he tells them is important, or what parts of the story he chooses to focus on. That's not learning. That's not education. Certainly not formal education, what you should be paying tuition for, formal education. So that's the problem. But as I said, as I continue to work in teaching, I really believe that the assignments that students are given to work on, the kind of work that they're asked to do, the grading, the purpose and the focus of reviewing their work and grading their work and giving feedback, it really challenges us to answer the question, what is the goal of education? And if you're in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, you'll notice that our assignments are very different from other schools' assignments, and it's because of this. Other school assignments, they might give the kids these, little quizzes where you're asked a few questions about a reading or something like that. That's not going to do it. That's not real education. They may be given lists of comprehension questions where they're asked to get answers. That's really not going to do it. And how can we know that that's not real education? Because that's the kind of stuff that can be cheated on. The problem that we have with cheating, which I've talked about recently, it's largely owed to the encyclopedic nature of modern schools. That's why cheating is so rampant, because you can cheat, because you're not being tested in your progress in the actual skills of learning. You're being tested for your access to information, and Google and ChatGPT can provide all that information, just like a calculator can provide answers to any problems. Modern math classes, they have the same problem. If you go back to classical mathematics, we're learning the principles of quantities. We're learning the principles of the 4 different kinds of quantities that exist. That's classical mathematics. If you come to modern mathematics, we've just got, set categories of problems that need to be solved in schools, and the students are simply tested to see whether they've learned the 3-step method to solve this problem and that problem. You can find the answers to all of these questions on the internet, and so cheating is easy because the nature of the education is not real. It's not really testing individual progress in learning. It's testing this fake idea of learning that Google can supply for us. We don't need human beings who act like Google because we have Google. I see this all the time and laugh at it. You'll see someone, for example, go onto social media and they'll post on Facebook and they'll say, does anybody know how to blah, blah, blah? And Google can provide better answers than someone who happens to be on social media. Why would you be asking for information on social media when you've got Google? You can see that people use social media to talk about things just because they want to talk about them, sometimes just for attention. And it doesn't make any sense because you could find the answer to that in 10 seconds. Like to go on Google and say, what time is the library open until? Google can answer that in 10 seconds. It makes no sense to post it on social media and wait for an hour for someone to respond. But we continue to do this just for attention, just because usually we want people to know what we're thinking about or something like that. But all of that information is already available, already easily accessible. There's no value in being a human being who can give people that information. And the kind of intellectual work that human beings do need to do, human beings are not doing that kind of work. But they're pretending like what we need is for Tommy to be like a cheap, inaccurate, and limited version of Google or ChatGPT. And it's the same dilemma that we had with calculators 30 years ago. If we've got calculators that can easily solve basic mathematical problems, then obviously solving basic mathematical problems is not the goal of mathematical education, because the calculator makes that appear ridiculous. And so rather than challenging the math program and asking, wait a minute, is this really what we should be studying in math classes? We just say, no calculators are allowed. Let's pretend and you just see how dumb that is. The school, with its faulty philosophy of education has to actually restrict the technology that education is supposedly working to develop. You can just see the internal contradictions in this because the outcomes are refuting the purpose of what's actually being practiced. You can't bring a calculator to a classical arithmetic course. You can't bring a calculator to a classical geometry course because they're not going to help you. You can't go on Google and search for a theme where you express your judgment on an issue and provide valid arguments and true assertions with evidence. You're not going to go Google that without people knowing that you're just making stuff up or pulling information from some other source. You can't cheat in a real education, and that's one of the easy measures of the system of education. Is it something that can be cheated on? If so, then we know it's not real education because you can't cheat in real education. So, to wrap this up, I want to say one more thing about assessment, just so parents and students understand this. When I grade student work, this is what I'm thinking about. This is what I'm paying attention to. This is what I'm evaluating. I'm looking to help students make progress in the arts of learning. That's my concern. I'm not concerned, even in a history class, for example, or a science class, I'm not concerned that they get all the history information right. I'm not concerned that they've got all of the information in the biology lesson right. What I'm concerned with is that they're learning the arts of learning. I'm concerned that they're reasoning. I'm concerned that they're giving evidence for things that they say. I'm concerned that they're learning how to approach a study and enter into it and work through it critically. That's what I'm concerned with. I'm also concerned with whether they're making priorities of the classical liberal arts and not just wasting their time in all of this silly encyclopedic learning in enrichment courses and substituting that for a real education, which they have access to in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. So this is my focus in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. It's why I think that assignments should be very open in the sense that it forces the student to work from a text that's available and gather the information himself, learn the principles, identify the principles, study and practice those principles, learn how to access information directly from a text source. It's why I don't want to make videos where the child sits there drooling, watching a video, and call that that's not learning. I want the student to learn how to approach a text, how to break a text down into parts, how to attack the text, study the text, seek out the author's intent, evaluate assertions that are made, ask whether they're true, identify arguments that are made, and so on, identify whether they're conclusive. That's the kind of thing that students need to be working on, not just collecting and regurgitating information. That's not true education. So I hope that homeschool parents can learn to resist this temptation. If there's any hope for true education to be restored, I really believe it's going to come through homeschooling. I don't believe schools are going to do it because they're under pressure of raising tuition money. I also don't believe that schools are going to do it. I don't believe private schools are going to do it because you're going to have all of these local schools and there are not expert teachers available for these schools, that they're not going to have a faculty of expert classical liberal arts teachers to actually lead students through these things. They're just going to have modern teachers available. I don't think schools are going to accomplish this. I don't think private schools are going to accomplish this. I really believe that if this restoration of real education is going to be accomplished, it's going to come through homeschooling families. And they're going to be very few in number because, like I said, even in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, where things are spelled out and repeated constantly on these subjects, the parents still resort to the same errors. There's a proverb that says, As a dog returns to its vomit, so a fool to his folly. And it's a very graphic proverb. It's intended to be graphic, to make a point. But the idea is that you've got this image of this dog who's eaten something bad and has vomited it up because it's bad. And then the dog will eat it again, even though it's already proven itself to be bad. And the fool does the same thing with his folly. And we see Christian families doing this in private schooling. We see them doing it in homeschooling. And I'm hoping that we can break this cycle and do what we know. I mean, once we go through these things, it becomes very clear what the problem is and what needs to be done. And then there are many families, many parents that just stick their fingers in their ears and close their eyes and just go right back to the same error because they're too lazy to undertake the work. They're too cowardly to move away from the crowd, even though they know the crowd is headed nowhere. They just aren't willing to do it. And that's really the biggest obstacle for the restoration of real Christian education. So I hope that that's helpful. I hope that gives you an idea about what my focus is in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, why our assignments are as they are, why we focus on the Classical Liberal Arts courses, and why I constantly focus on them. Even if you look at the live classes that I offer the students, you're going to see that the live classes I offer are always focused on these core skills. And we're not going to get into information gathering. I've already had parents ask me to do live classes for history and live classes for science, just so we can have these information sessions, and that is not what the kids need. I'm going to announce today that I'm starting on Fridays to offer live classes on Fridays in English writing, logic, and reasoning, so we can focus more on these skills. But that's really what distinguishes the Classical Liberal Arts Academy from everybody else. That's what distinguishes my interaction with the students from everybody else, and why I think that if students will engage and follow the directions in our program to focus on these arts, which actually seek to train them to become independent learners with the skills of learning that are necessary, they're the ones who are going to go off into adult life and actually influence the sciences, influence different fields of study and work, because they're going to have the skills, they're going to have the tools to be able to do that. And for all the talk, the information schools are not raising students who are going to do that. For all of their talk about raising leaders and impacting the world, and they're just raising information gatherers, and all that leads to is party politics. That's all that leads to. One group learns one set of information, another group learns a different set of information, and they just fight against each other forever in political squabbles, and that's not real learning. So I hope that's helpful. If you've got any questions about these things, or would like some help planning your children's studies, I'm available for consultation. I've got office hours on Friday afternoons. I'm willing to arrange private Zoom meetings with parents to talk about these things. You just have to take the first step and get in touch, because the help is available. You've got to make use of it. But I hope that's helpful. God bless. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy works to research, restore, publish, and teach the classical Catholic curriculum enjoyed by wise men and saints throughout history. To join us for classical Catholic studies or to learn more about the programs available, visit classicalliberalarts.com.